Welcome back to the Pauper Metagame. Today it is time for the long-awaited evaluation of Tron. The first thing I should mention about Tron is that Tron comes in several different iterations. When you hear that somebody's playing a Tron deck, the next question you should ask is, okay, which one? So first I want to talk about the default deck list you're going to find when you click on 5-color Tron on MTG Goldfish, which is a primarily blue, let's say, then next red, and then you got the other colors sprinkled in. The only black in the deck is a Doomblade. The only green in the deck is Moment's Peace, and the only white is in the sideboard in the form of Circle of Protection Red and Coalition Honor Guard. So Coalition Honor Guard in the sideboard, this does the same thing as the Standard Bearer, only instead of being a 1/1, it's a 2/4. Which makes it even more annoying. The only reason that more people don't run Coalition Honor Guard over the Standard Bearer is because it costs 4 mana instead of 2 mana, which is not inconsequential unless you're playing Tron, because the difference between 1 white and 1 colorless and 1 white and 3 colorless is not that big of a difference for Tron as compared to most decks. Anyway, the main things to talk about, the different Tron decks. Probably the most important thing to look at across the spectrum is the consistency with which they're pushing to assemble Tron, along with the amount of life gain they're trying to accomplish versus card draw versus threats. So the standard list you're going to find isn't really pushing life gain that hard. Oh, I forgot to mention in the green color we've also got Pulse of Murasa, which is the life gain angle that the standard list you're going to find when you look this up runs. And the whole idea here with this particular deck list is that you're going to utilize Pulse of Murasa to get your creatures back and gain life. Also, if you think, well, I'll shut down Tron by just blowing up their land, they can Pulse of Murasa back Tron pieces. Then after they use Pulse of Murasa, they can Mnemonic Wall the Pulse of Murasa back. They could get out, if they get out 2 Mnemonic Walls, then they can also use Ghostly Flicker to blink both Mnemonic Walls, return the Ghostly Flicker, and return the Pulse of Murasa. They can, if they ever get both Mnemonic Walls out with a Ghostly Flicker, you're probably losing anyway though, because of they have access now to infinitely get back any sorcery or instant they want. And if they hit the Denrova Horror with a Mnemonic Wall, this is the typical combo lock that this deck utilizes by using Ghostly Flicker to blink Mnemonic Wall and Denrova Horror, using the Mnemonic Wall to get back the Ghostly Flicker. And then the Denrova Horror, when it comes into play, it bounces one of your permanents, and then you have to discard that permanent. Which basically means if they've got, it's not an infinite sort of thing, but it doesn't really need to be infinite. With the Tron mana that they have access to, if they've got 9 mana available, that means that they can make you bounce and discard 3 permanents. If they do that a couple of turns in a row, your board's gone. Even after just doing it 1 turn, your threats are gone. The second turn, your land are pretty devastated. And it's just one of those things that once they get this combo going, you're going to be in pretty bad shape. The other stuff I should talk about, the deck runs Mulldrifters, Seagate Oracle, a couple of Ghostly Flickers, Mystical Teachings, Forbidden Alchemy, Exclude. These are all cards that help generate card advantage. There's also some Condescends for card selection. So this is a type of a list that isn't pushing the consistency as hard on hitting the Tron pieces. The only real assistance that they're giving their deck are 4 copies of Expedition Map. So they've got 4 tutors to help hit their land, and then of course the card draw is going to help smooth out the land draws, but it's not going to help in the early game that much. And what I mean is, when you look at the kind of card advantage stuff they're running, Mystical Teachings, Forbidden Alchemy, degenerate things they can do with Ghost Flicker, Exclude, Mulldrifter, Mnemonic Walls, Seagate Oracle, none of this stuff comes online before turn 3, which means none of this card draw is going to help ensure that they hit their Tron by turn 3. The only thing they have to help with that is 4 copies of Expedition Map, and again, they don't have anything like Preordain or anything like that usually to help them find the Expedition Maps sooner either. So having 4 tutors in your deck is huge, but as we'll get to in a little bit, There are certainly other iterations of Tron that go much more all in on making sure that they can hit their Tron pieces with consistency. This deck trades off the consistency and making sure they always hit their Tron pieces. It's willing to allow for a little more variance in that they won't always hit their Tron pieces as quickly, so their early game might be a little shakier. To help make up for that, they've got some removal pieced in there, they've got some moments pieces in the main, plus usually one or two more in the sideboard they can bring in. Things that they can use to stall the game long enough to assemble their pieces, and once that happens, the deck has an absurd mid to late game by being able to have a lot more mana than you and a lot more ridiculous card draw advantage and card advantage engines just built into the deck. Just blinking any combination of creatures with a ghostly flicker is backbreaking, even if they're not able to get some kind of a mnemonic wall combination going. Just having out a Seagate Oracle and a Muldrifter, and because Ghostly Flicker is an instant, they can just bide their time and wait until you tap out, and once you do at instant speed, they can blink a Muldrifter and a Seagate Oracle to net 3 cards. So netting a 3-for-1 is pretty obscene, and then maybe you manage to finally kill a Muldrifter, so no problem, they'll Pulse of Mirass it back, recast the Muldrifter, you kill it again, they play a Mnemonic Wall, get the Pulse, use the Pulse to get the Muldrifter, play it again. The deck just gets absurd in terms of the amount of cards that it can generate. They can Mystical Teachings and or just naturally draw into Pulse, and then again, Ghostly Flicker, if they can get both Mnemonic Walls out, is an option they can use to just recycle anything they want in their deck. Once they can Ghostly Flicker both Mnemonic Walls, you're in big trouble because they can get extra counter spells to hold up for defense and then access pretty much whatever they need to. A Mnemonic Wall and a Denrovenhor, again, that combination is just going to lock you out. And even something like Mnemonic Wall Muldrifter is really nasty because they can just draw boatloads of cards. Same thing with Seagate Oracle Mnemonic Wall. So any combination with Mnemonic Wall is just going to get ridiculous real fast. Now let's talk about the weaknesses of this type of deck. The issue with this deck is because it can stumble on assembling its Tron, and because it's not going to have consistency in the early game with having colored mana. Probably the ideal open for a Tron deck is turn 1 Expedition Map, turn 1 Prophetic Prism, and then on turn 3 having Tron assembled by hitting a Tron piece every turn. And even in this kind of ideal style situation, there's a very good likelihood they've only got access to one actual colored mana. Maybe if they got lucky and they actually natural Tron and can drop Prophetic Prism on turn 1 and turn 3, then they might be in a little bit better shape. But overall, the point is, even though they're going to have a lot of mana, on turns 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, it's not uncommon for them to still be bottlenecked and only being able to cast a couple of spells each turn because they don't have enough colored mana to get the job done. By the time you start getting between turns 5 to turn 9, they usually have enough colored mana in Tron to where they can start casting multiple spells and doing a lot of degenerate things. So that's one issue. So basically, having inconsistent Tron hits early on can allow a really fast deck to just run over Tron. Even if they assemble Tron, if they're unable to access enough colored mana, you can blow them up as well. There's some other things that may not seem intuitive at first, but something like, for example, if I recently talked about goblins, if you're running goblins, if you're able to apply pressure early and then use some artifact destruction to blow up a Prophetic Prism that they drop on turn 2, it's just going to create problems for them if they have to decide between trying to push to set up their Tron versus making sure that they have access to colored mana so they're sure that they can keep doing Moment's Peace. And if they only have one colored mana up to play Moment's Peace, they're not able to really do much anything else to further their game with the other Urza's lands that they might have online. So the colored mana is an issue some people might not be aware of that aren't familiar with the deck. Also, minor inconsistencies, even with the 4 tutors, as far as hitting the Urza's land early, mean that this is a deck that a fast pressure can make a big difference in terms of whether or not you're going to win or lose. Now, the deck might just naturally get busted straight natural Tron draws and get exactly what it needs, be able to Moment's Peace through disruption, and there's just going to be games where it draws the nuts and it's going to be very hard to beat. But this style of deck where it's trying to have a really powerful, potent mid to late game is certainly susceptible to that early disruption. On the other side of the spectrum, this deck is not going to apply major pressure to you early on. So if you're playing a deck that has land destruction that can undermine their Urza's lands again, keep in mind they can pull some Murasa their Urza lands back, so you might also need to have graveyard removal with that to truly stop their plan. But if you're able to disrupt their Tron lands, that's going to level the playing field quite a bit. The other thing is if they just don't apply a lot of pressure to you and you're playing a control style deck, you could actually win by just being very careful with what you do with your removal cards and your counter spells. Here's the reason why. They don't have very many win conditions. You've got a Dinrova, and of course granted you could always beat someone to death with some combination of Seagate Oracles and Muldrifters, but if you're playing a control deck, having extra removal that you can occasionally use to pop off Seagate Oracle and Muldrifter is not going to be too much of a problem for you, while also holding back more removal to make sure you can always kill the real problematic creatures, which is Mnemonic Wall and Dinrova Horror. You got to be very careful about using your last removal spell on a Muldrifter or a Seagate Oracle if you haven't seen a Mnemonic Wall yet, or the Dinrova Horror, because these are the creatures that will really blow you out. Also, you want to be very careful about utilizing your removal when they have 3 mana open, including access to blue, because if you try to blow up a Muldrifter and they Ghostly Flicker in response, that's going to be a pretty nasty blowout. So you have to be very careful with how you utilize your removal because of Ghostly Flicker, and even then you have to be very selective about what you take out, because you really want to watch for Mnemonic Wall, because that's what allows them to run away with the game with recursing different sorceries and instants. And you also have to be careful about making sure you can kill their Dinrova Horror so they don't lock you out with the Dinrova, Mnemonic Wall, Ghostly Flicker quasi combo. The other thing to keep in mind, once again, is they can Pulsive Murasa back any of these threats that you can kill. So having access to graveyard removal is really important. I think that Mojuka Bog or Relic of Progenitus or Nile Spellbomb or Fairy Macabre, these are all really important exiling options to have access to somewhere in your main deck or sideboard. It's just, I don't even know how, it's really hard to, if you have a blisteringly fast deck you might be able to get away without having graveyard hate, but if you're playing any kind of mid-range control deck, you've just got to have access to that stuff to compete with a Tron strategy that's going to abuse its graveyard. So moving along, getting back to the point, Tron doesn't have a lot of threats. So you've got Dinrova Horror, and then you've got Rolling Thunder. These are the real threats. Now, the other sort of passive threat that the deck presents is generating a ton of card advantage, recurring and recycling and abusing its graveyard with the Ghostly Flicker. So you just want to be very careful to make sure that you're sandbagging your removal, so when they try to play Ghostly Flicker with Counterspell backup, you've got, you know, double removal plus a counterspell. You've got enough reach to win that war, and you have to patiently wait for them to initiate it, or you have to hit their stuff when they're tapped out. You just have to be very careful about how you get into that you can win that battle and that you're going to be the last person to respond. If you can do that, then you might, if you can shut down their Ghostly Flicker, if you can exile their graveyard, and just be very careful that you're not counterspelling random stupid stuff that you don't need to counterspell. For example, let them kill all your creatures. If you're playing a mid-range control deck, they're going to have enough, even though they don't have a ton of removal, they're going to be able to present enough things that you don't want to waste your time counterspelling Moment's Peace, Doomblade, Flame Slash, Electrickery. You also don't want to be getting into counter wars. If they try to counterspell your creature, most of the time you just need to accept that. If they exclude one of your creatures that's not a Muldrifter, then most of the time you just need to live with that fact, because you really, really, really want to save your counter spells to make sure that when those pivotal moments arise with Ghostly Flicker, Mnemonic Wall, and Rolling Thunder and Dinrova Horror, you've got the final say in those situations. If you can make sure that they're never able to abuse Ghostly Flicker, that they cannot resolve a Rolling Thunder, and they cannot resolve a Dinrova Horror more than once, it cannot resolve their Mnemonic Walls more than once. By the way, it's okay if you let Mnemonic Wall and Dinrova Horror hit the board. You just want to make very sure that they can't abuse them with Ghostly Flicker. If you can do those things, if you can shut down, basically we're talking about 3 to 4 cards. If you can make sure Dinrova Horror, Rolling Thunder, and Ghostly Flicker, if you can control those 3 cards, and then card number 4 being Demonic Wall, you're going to be in pretty good shape. The next thing you have to watch out for is Pulse of Murasa. So making sure that you're very careful. You can let them resolve all kinds of junk. You just need to make sure that if you're playing some kind of mid-range control deck, you probably have access to some measure of card draw and things to keep you from falling too far behind in the card advantage situation. And what basically ends up happening is, in the early game, there's not really an advantage for anybody in a control, like a blue-black control versus Tron matchup. Nobody really has any huge advantage early on. And then in the mid-game, Tron has a big advantage because it's able to come up with big mana before a blue-black control deck can. And any kind of control versus control matchup, whoever has more mana is in great shape. Once again, as I've said before, if you watch any kind of Grand Prix or pro tournament coverage, you'll always hear them talk about in control versus control matchups how important it is to hit your land drops. And Tron gets this land acceleration through Tron that's just clutch and allows them to start jamming more value in the mid game, while blue-black control has to be very careful about where they're spending their mana. Now, by the late game, if blue-black control can actually survive long enough to assemble 8-9 mana, now it's going to be able to execute enough threats to push back. And again, you don't have to win every single exchange. You just have to make sure that Dinrova Horror, Demonic Wall, and Ghostly Flicker don't get out of control, and they're not able to successfully resolve a Rolling Thunder. Everything else is just making sure you don't fall too far behind. And that's pretty much it. So basically, in the long game, another control deck is going to be just fine. It's that mid to starting to be late game where Tron will have a pretty good chance to blow out a control deck. Another thing to keep in mind is if you're running something like blue-black control or something that has access to white that's playing control, playing either Palace Sentinels or Thorn of the Black Rose. These are going to be great options. Those are both of the creatures that give you the Monarch token and allow you to draw an extra card every turn as long as your opponent doesn't deal combat damage to you. And as you can see, with 2 Demonic Walls that can't attack you, a Seagate Oracle that you can block with almost anything, and a playset of Mull Drifters and a Dinrova Horror, this deck is not going to be applying a lot of pressure against you. So if you're on turn 4 able to resolve a Monarch token, that's going to be a huge game for you, because it means now you can really sit back and focus on making sure they don't resolve their most important cards. And it doesn't even matter if you're not able to, jam other card drawing spells, because now you're getting an extra card every turn no matter what. So there's that. Alright, let's move. Oh, well, I guess I should also talk about a few of the other things going on here. Basically, as far as what Tron's trying to do, if you're playing this deck, you want to be sure that you're reacting to the aggressive decks enough to stay alive, because if you're just able to stay alive through those early turns, then you're going to get there as the game progresses. If you're against the control deck, you really want to push to overload them in the mid game, because you have so much more mana before they do that's when you've got to push through to try to overload them with the right combination of cards to win. Also, keep in mind that Rolling Thunder is just amazing, so don't waste it. Against aggressive decks, it's your Wrath of God. Against control decks, it's just win on the spot. So don't use this to kill off 2 or 3 creatures against another control deck or mid-range deck unless you really have to, because it's much better to allow them to maybe have a creature or 2 floating around, wait for them to tap out, just win the game. So there's that. So basically, you've got counterspells, you've got a ton of value creatures, you're trying to assemble combinations that, basically using Pulse of Murasa to pulse any of your creatures is going to give you good value. Ghostly Flickering any of your creatures is going to give you value. You can use something like Electricity, Flame Slash, Doomblade, Moment's Peace. Your Condescend and Exclude to try to deal with threats in the early game, and then that helps get you to your value cards. If you know your opponent is running Mull Drifters, then you want to save and exclude for that, because excluding a Mull Drifter is pretty just amazing. Even though on its face it may not seem like a blowout, you're stopping your opponent from getting a 2/2 and drawing 2 cards, and you get a cantrip, so it's pretty absurd. As far as the sideboard goes, you've got another Electrickery, which is good. In fact, I think just having one Electrickery in the main and only having one in the sideboard might be a little bit of a mistake. I think that might be a little bit greedy with how much aggression there is from 1/1 and potential hexproof creatures out there. I would want to have access to at least 3, if not 4 copies of Electrickery. Gorilla Shaman is, of course, a nod to affinity. I would say the upside to running Gorilla Shaman in a Tron list is the fact that you can blow up a lot of other artifacts you might not normally be able to, by virtue of the fact that you've got a lot of mana in these Urzatron decks. Also, Gorilla Shaman is something that can be interesting. I'm not saying you should necessarily board it in every time, but it's something you should think about if it's a Tron versus Tron matchup. Blowing up all of your opponent's prophetic prisms and signets is a real problem for the opposing Tron player. Again, they can get stuck on not having... I mean, imagine a situation where you've actually got access to 11 mana, but you've only got access to 2 colored mana. That means even though you have 11 mana, you still can't play more than 2 spells a turn. So if a Gorilla Shaman can get in there and blow up some prophetic prisms and some signets, now it's just getting really awkward for the other Tron players. So it's kind of a weird potential techie thing to do in the mirror match. And there's also another thing I'll put out, like some people think that if you boarded a Gorilla Shaman to get something like a Boros deck, you know, the Boros Monarch decks out there, that you can really get a lot of value. But the artifacts that they're running, blowing them up a lot of times doesn't matter. You might get lucky and they have a lot of artifact land in their opening hand, and you can really slow them down, causes some problems. But most of the time, blowing up their artifacts is not as big of a game in that particular matchup. But it's still something you think about. Just the fact that Gorilla Shaman can actually come in against more than just affinity, especially in a Tron list, is something you should be thinking about. Having 3 Hydroblast and 3 Pyroblast is interesting. So let's talk about what I think about these. The Hydroblast, primarily, in my opinion, is there for burn decks, hyper-aggressive red decks like the aggro red deck and or goblins, and then also for potentially affinity, because all the nastiest things that affinity can do are all red, which is flinging, smashing you with an ATOG, or flinging the ATOG, of course, that's what I mean by flinging, and then also throwing a battle rage on an ATOG. These are all basically some of the nastiest things they can do. So Hydroblast stops all of that. Now, because we have 2 copies of Gorilla Shaman in our sideboard also, the other thing I should go back to on affinity is Tron also has the option of running, there's a Ancient Grudge, which is a red and colorless to blow up an artifact, and then I think you can flash it back for a green. So Ancient Grudge is also an interesting consideration, just because it's efficient, and you can actually get your Ancient... Not only can you flash back Ancient Grudge, but you can blink it with Mnemonic Wall. So there's a lot of abuse that you can utilize with the way this deck works by having that artifact destruction on a sorcery, and having the flashback means you always get value, even if you can't Mnemonic Wall. So Gorilla Shaman is not necessarily an automatic reason to... Or I'm sorry, when you're playing Tron, Gorilla Shaman is not the automatic go-to for your affinity hate. Anyway, moving along, Pyroblast is basically just here to pay respect to the Delver decks that are out there, and to get the edge against other blue, grindy mid-range control decks that are leaning on counterspells. So I think Hydroblast and Pyroblast are both good. I don't know about 3. Maybe 2 of each might be a little more appropriate. So okay, so here we get to Ancient Grudge. This is interesting. I mean, this is a lot of affinity hate right here. Maybe a little bit much. I don't know that you really need 2 Ancient Grudges and 2 Gorilla Shamans. Maybe just run 3 Ancient Grudges and free up some more sideboard space. Circle of Protection red. I mean, again, having 3 Hydroblasts plus the COP red. This is certainly a lot of hate for the red decks. You know, against burn, you've theoretically already got Pulse. So anyway, Moment's Peace. Again, I think I mentioned this earlier, but we've got a few copies in the main deck in most of these lists. It's really, really good against slowing down other aggressive strategies long enough to give you a chance to assemble your Tron. Already talked about Coalition Honor Guard. Ulamog's Crusher, this is sort of the surprise throw-in, because when a lot of decks see that you're not running a ton of creatures, they might board out some of their removal. You bring in an Ulamog's Crusher, you drop that on turn 3 or 4, and that can really be a nasty blowout, just win on the spot kind of situation. Things that are leaning on red removal probably won't be able to do enough damage to shut down the Ulamog. So unless they have access to some way to actually exile or destroy or implement a sack effect, which basically means they have to have white or black, otherwise they're going to be in a little bit of trouble. So that's pretty much Tron as far as the typical popular list you're going to see right now. I do want to talk about a few other iterations of Tron though. So here's kind of a sort of a weird, more blue-green sort of a focus deck, and this still has the Dinrova, Muldrifter, and Demonic Wall, so you get Oracle package, but they throw in Stonehorn Dignitary, which is a creature, when it comes into play, your opponent skips their next combat step. So this is, if you feel like you're facing just nothing but non-stop aggressive decks, this is really nice. The Stonehorn Dignitary is pretty worthless against other mid-range control decks because it's not really helping you do a whole lot. But against aggressive decks, this is a blowout. The 4 toughness means it doesn't die to a bolt, and you could actually use the Demonic Wall and the Ghostly Flicker Abuse to just basically blink Stonehorn Dignitary every single turn, which is just a nasty thing. Like, for example, a deck like Elves are going to be in real trouble. They can never attack in for the win. They don't really have a lot of removal options. They're just in big trouble against something like a Stonehorn Dignitary. We have the Condescend. Now here's where we see crop rotation as another option to get a little more consistency on our Tron composition. Although here we just have the singular copy. Moment's Peace prohibits a reasonable counterspell. Condescend and Prohibit seem to usually be the counterspells of choice just because they lean on colorless mana instead of a straight counterspell that's double blue. Compulsive Research, Ghost Flicker. I mean, this is all pretty well the same kind of stuff. I should mention Hunted Fingraph is also interesting because you don't have in a lot of these Tron lists, you don't have a ton of different creatures. Whenever you pop your Hunted Fingraph, whatever you get back is going to be value. Fingraph is just a land you can spend some mana, sack it, and get back a random creature to your hand. Also, once again, you could use Pulse of Murasa to get back the Hunted Fingraph. Then you could use your Demonic Wall to get the Pulse back, and recycle, abuse, repeat kind of a thing. So this is just another option to recur your creatures in addition to the Pulse, if you want to take a longer, more convoluted route. Because yes, instead of pulsing back a Hunted Fingraph, you could just pulse a creature. But maybe you don't want to get a creature yet. Maybe you don't need a creature right now, but you'd like to make sure you have access to getting one back later, and you want to go ahead and gain the life off of the Pulse of Murasa. This is an option. So this sideboard has Dispel, Gutshot. Let's see here. Shattering Pulse. This is another card. This is one of the main reasons I wanted to talk about this list. Shattering Pulse is really interesting because the buyback means you can just go ham on blowing up other artifacts. The reason why I'm not as excited about Shattering Pulse in this slot is because it's not doing what you need it to do. Where you really need to have some artifact hate is against Affinity, because it's so fast that it's going to have a reasonable chance to blow you out before you can assemble your Tron plan. Which means you don't need artifact destruction on turn 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on to lock someone out. You want artifact destruction on 2, 3, and 4. Turns 2, 3, and 4, and land drops 2, 3, and 4. Ancient Grudge and Gorilla Shaman are going to be a lot more effective in that plan. I also like the Ancient Grudge because it can blow up their artifact creatures and buy you more time, whereas in the early turns, and really, well, I guess in any turn, the Gorilla Shaman is really just going to be blowing up land and stuff like that. So Serrated Arrows is also pretty interesting because if you resolve a Serrated Arrows, you can use that to just start beating down on fairies. I mean, a resolved Serrated Arrows is a nightmare for fairy decks. And also, the fact that Ghostly Flicker allows you to also flicker artifacts means that that resolved Serrated Arrows is going to be something that could stick around forever. So against elves, against fairies, against anything that's leaning hard on 1/1s, this is just a beating if it resolves, and it's colorless mana, which is quite significant for this type of a deck. Alright, moving along, we've got a more just red, green, blue sort of composition, and this deck is leaning on Chromatic Sphere, Chromatic Star. We've got the 4 Expedition Mags, so we've got these stars, these chromatic stars and chromatic spheres. We've got some extra cantrips, we've got some extra color smoothing, and here we have the Fingraph Marauder. So this is a creature that It's a 6 mana 5/5, and whenever an artifact is put into the graveyard from play, you gain 5 life. So you get a Fingraph Marauder into play on turn 3 or 4, and then you already probably have a Chromatic Sphere or Chromatic Star that you were saving, and you start popping those off, and you're gaining 5 life a pop. That's going to be pretty nasty. This deck runs an extra copy of Rolling Thunder as an extra sweeper/finisher option. It's also utilizing Ancient Stirrings. So here's where we start to see a list that's utilizing a lot of consistency in assembling its Tron. It's got more life gain, but it's foregoing having the absurd levels of card advantage. Notice there's no Ghostly Flicker package. We don't have in the spells area, we have no blue cards, so we're not just trying to get absurd amounts of card advantage through card draw. The Ancient Stirrings, the Expedition maps, and also by virtue of having Chromatic Sphere and Chromatic Star as early potential cantrips, allow you to hit your Tron with a high level of consistency. This is really nice. Also, we've got access to Muldrifter, Seagate Oracle. We got the Ulamog Crusher for early blowout potential. You can use Haunted Fingraph to get your creatures back. So just because it's not abusing Ghostly Flicker, don't think that this is not going to be a really powerful, potent style of deck. Also, since this particular Tron list is going to have a high level of consistency in assembling its Tron, against other Tron matchups, it's going to have a reasonable chance of getting a little bit faster tempo, although I guess you don't really want to call it tempo because it's not like the deck's really going to be applying pressure, but it's going to be able to start resolving maybe threats in the form of Ulamog's Crusher and Fingraph Marauder, but also more importantly when we get into sideboard games, it's going to be able to get to and utilize its land destruction fairly quickly. Now, this sideboard has 3 copies of Stone Rain, and I'm trying to remember, there's actually a 4 mana, it's 1 red, 3 colorless, destroy target land sorcery, but you can flash it back for like 2 red and 5 colorless, or it's like 7 mana or something like that. But if I'm running a Tron list, then I want to be running the flashback land destruction option. I forget what that silly thing is called, but if you just if you're on Magic Online, just look up Pauper Legal red land destruction spells and you'll find it. Or you can go on to Scryfall and dig around and find it. I forget what it's called right now, but basically I don't think Stone Rain is the most optimal card in this slot right here. Ray of Revelation is fine. Something that these other lists have been lacking is some enchantment removal. This is just, you know, something good. There's actually a straight enchantment deck that gets blown out by having a global enchant removal or recursive enchantment removal. It's pretty obscure. There's also Boggles, which has fallen way down in the meta, but it's still out there. And there's just all kinds of other random things. There's also gosh, I still can't remember the name of the card, but it's a 3-costed enchantment, blue, 2 colorless curse that you can put on your opposing player that mills them for 2 cards every turn. Because Tron can get stuck in a dirtling pattern for a while, something like that could sneak out some wins against Tron. So Ray of Revelation is just good in a lot of different places. So I do like having access to 1 enchantment removal in the sideboard, at least as an option. Other than that, we've got Hallow here. This is probably mostly a nod to burn and or fleeing and things like that. Although because we don't have the recursive nonsense with the mnemonic wall, we're not recurring these options. So anyway, this is a more consistent deck in terms of the early game. It also has more life gain, so it's going to have a better game against burn and aggressive decks, but it doesn't have the absurd levels of late game card advantage abuse. Last off, I want to talk about this mono green Tron. Now, if you look this up on Goldfish, it's labeled white, blue, black, red, green. Don't know why. You do have Electrickery in the sideboard, but really this is just mono green. It's got the Haunted Fingraphs to try to get a little bit of card advantage. It's also got some Tree of Tales here as well. But what this deck is trying to do is we've got 4 Ancient Stirrings, 4 Crop Rotations, 4 Expedition Map, 3 Chromatic Stars, and 3 Chromatic Spheres and 4 Chromatic Stars. So this is a deck list that is going all out on making sure Tron is assembled consistently. I mean, this is just kind of nuts to think about. Imagine an all-common format where you're assembling Tron utilizing 8 tutors in the form of 4 crop rotation and 4 expedition map, and a card like Ancient Stirrings, which isn't quite a tutor, but I mean it basically functions like a tutor. If your opening hand has something like an Ancient Stirrings and a expedition map, if you Ancient Stirrings first, like if you've got 1 Tron piece in your hand and then you pop off your Ancient Stirrings, say on turn 2 you drop a Chromatic Sphere on turn 1, use that to use your Ancient Stirrings on turn 2, you hit another Tron piece and drop that, and then you utilize your tutor to hit your 3rd piece. So this is the kind of stuff the deck can do with a lot of consistency. Crop rotation is there in case in the early game maybe you turn 1 you drop a Kalani Garden, get a 0/1 blocker out there. Turn 2 you drop a Tron piece, and then also in turn 2 you crop rotate out the Kalani Garden, hit another Tron piece, drop a Prophetic Prism, and then you tutor up your last piece with any combination of well, you don't really want to crop rotate at that point, but using Ancient Stirrings and Expedition Map to get your last Tron piece after that is pretty sweet. So the creature package is interesting. You've got Fierce Empath to make sure and continue to hit your big nasty threats. You got the Fangren Marauder to gain life and is also a nice beater. The Accomplished Automaton is also interesting because it allows you to get, it's a 7 mana 5/7 with Fabricate 1, so if you're a little bit worried about your opponent having a lot of sack effects because there are a lot of edicts out there, throwing out some extra 1/1 creatures goes a long way. Or it can just be a really ridiculous 6/8 body. Wretched Griff is a 3/4 flyer that cantrips, costs 7, so this doesn't get you as many cards as a Muldrifter, but it's a much more opposing threat. I mean, you don't see much bigger than a 2/3 in regular Pauper decks as far as flyers go these days. So this 3/4 really goes over the top in the air as far as battling in the air in the current Pauper meta. Ulamog's Crusher is just a nasty beat stick. So this is a deck that goes real heavy on assembling Tron with great consistency, has access to some nice life gain, is really light on card advantage. The only kind of card advantage-y type things the deck's really going after, it's got a cantrip on the Griff, it's got access to the Pulse of Murasa, does have some Haunted Fingraphs, so we're kind of doing some things, but it's not crazy on the card advantage side. Now I can't remember. Let's see if we can find. There's another creature. There's a creature that came out in one of the more recent sets. It was either Kaladesh or Aether Revolt. It's a 4/4. Let's see if we can find. Here, let's click on this Accomplished Automaton. Let's go check out Kaladesh to see if I can actually find what the heck I'm talking about. It's a 4/4 artifact creature that costs some absurd amount of mana, like 6 mana, 5 mana, 7 mana, I don't remember. And when it comes into play, you can go searching for I think another copy of the creature. So it's a nice big aggressive threat. 4/4 bodies do get after people and cause a lot of problems. As the oh, here we go, Self-Assembler. This is it. It's a 5 mana 4/4. When Self-Assembler enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an Assembly Worker creature card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. So this allows you to apply the kind of pressure that Affinity decks do. And as I was saying, Affinity is able to apply an absurd amount of pressure just by hitting a couple of 4/4s. If you've ever played against Affinity, a few fast 4/4 creatures, 3 4/4 creatures coming at you in a Pauper matchup, that is a lot. It may not seem like a lot. Tron can actually shell out all 4 of those. It's not that hard with this kind of a Tron list to be able to shell those out real quick, and you just could be in a situation really fast where you're looking at 4 or 5 really large creatures coming at you. So if I'm going to play the mono green version, I like having the self-assemblers in the deck. The Fierce Empath is there for consistency, but I would probably consider cutting some number, if not all of these, just to get the self-assembler in there, so that I've got a little more card advantage-y, aggressive sort of an engine. and it's not going to be hard to hit 10 mana and drop 2 of those a turn. Another thing that this mono green list is doing is it's making sure not only that it has greater consistency in hitting its Tron pieces, but it's also making sure that the kind of cards it's playing keep it from getting log jammed on colored mana, because it's got these colorless threats that it can deploy with Accomplished Automaton, Wretched Griff, Ulamog's Crusher, the self-assemblers that I just mentioned. It's got these chromatic spheres and chromatic stars that give it that early consistency in getting more colored mana. It's only playing a single colored deck, so it has that going for it as well. So usually it's not really hamstrung by having limitations on access to colored mana. It's just going to deploy as many threats as its total mana will allow, and it does have some expensive cards as well. Again, I don't want you to think, since this is the last list I'm talking about, and I'm talking about what it does well, that it's the best Tron deck. If it was the best Tron deck, it would be showing up in the metagame as the best Tron deck. The big Achilles heel on this particular list is that it does not have the necessary late game card advantage engine that the other Tron lists are going to be able to deploy. We don't have counter spells, we don't have Hydro and Pyroblast. These are all really powerful options. Also, just consider, with the Delver decks being the really two of the more aggressively played decks in the metagame right now, and between Is It Delver and, let's see, where is Mono Blue? Man, Mono Blue really, oh, I'm sorry, here it is. Really has fallen off a bit, but between Is It Delver and Mono Blue Delver, we're talking about 15% of the metagame. That's quite a bit. It may not sound like much, but it really is. You're going to run into one or both of these decks with a fair amount of consistency. And what these Delver decks can do is apply pressure in the air, and when they're applying pressure in the air, all these decks have to do is make sure that your Wretched Griff is counterspelled. That's the 3/4 flyer. And then they can even allow some of the other ground threats to resolve, do a little chump blocking, and basically just tempo you out. I mean, be in a situation where if the game had gone another 3 or 4 turns, yes, the green Tron deck would have won, but they're able to just squeak out getting that 20 points of damage in through the air before the green Tron list can. So they just make sure that they counterspell the Wretched Griffs and or have Screds available to kill those threats, and then just beat down in the air, stall on the ground, and yeah, a lot of times it's not going to be a great matchup. You also don't have access to the red hate in your sideboard that's really nice against these Delver decks. So the mono green list is pretty cool because of its consistency and what it's trying to do, but when Delver decks are at the top of the metagame, it's not going to be a very fun time playing something like that. Now, your typical regular old 5-color standard Tron deck list is going to have game against any of the mid-range and control-y decks out there. It's also going to have game against the Delver decks. A lot of it just depends on how things draw out. Tron is going to have the advantage against these Delver decks where, unless you play a turn 1 Delver, flip it on turn 2, and start going to town really fast, these Tron lists are going to be able to deploy things that you feel like you have to stop. And these Delver decks don't run a boatload of counter spells. The fairies, the Spell Stutter Sprite that can counterspell a spell equal to the number of fairies that Spell Stutter Sprite counterspells a spell with a converted mana cost equal to the number of fairies that you have in play. When you play the Spell Stutter Sprite, it has that triggered ability. A lot of the things in the Tron list that you really want to stop are really expensive. So they're able to play out a bunch of really expensive threats, and you're not able to counterspell all of them. And it's hard to execute an efficient tempo game plan when they're doing things like playing Moment's Peace, and they're playing things like Pulse of Murasa to gain life. You feel like you have to counterspell the Muldrifter, but you also feel like you kind of have to counterspell the Demonic Wall. You really want to counterspell Pulse of Murasa. You don't want to let them resolve Ghostly Flicker. You don't want to let them use Exclude on you. There's a lot of things that are going on here that can be really annoying, and they've got some removal. But if you are able to apply pressure quickly and consistently, if you're playing, particularly if you've got the Is It Delver version where you've got the Pyroblast in the sideboard, you're going to have a chance to tempo them out. But if the game gets very far along, these Delver decks don't have a ton of mana. So the normal mana advantages that these Tron decks can assemble is compounded by the fact that these Delver decks tend to run on 2-3 mana for a lot of turns a lot of the time. And so when you've got access to 3 mana and the Tron list has access to 9 mana, unless they're really stumbling on their colored mana, they're going to be deploying 3 or 4 threats a turn while you're deploying 1 or 2, and it's just, that's going to get out of hand really fast. So there's this narrow window of opportunity where the Delver decks can get it done, and they do, but Tron has game there. Tron's real problematic matchups really come with the really aggressive decks jamming it before it can recover, having access to land destruction, or being able to just carefully thread the needle with the control deck and stopping their threats in the exact correct combination and getting into that long game where you can out-card advantage them. The Monarch tokens are quite good. Again, the Pal Sentinels and the Thorn of the Black Rose. So that's one of the big things for Kuldotha-Boros. Not the actual Kuldotha-Boros, but the Monarch list that a lot of people run these days. You want to be sure you get that Monarch. You want to have all the Pal Sentinels that you can. And let's just look at this default. Last thing we're going to do is I'm going to mention when we look at the Boros Monarch deck. So this has 3 Palace Sentinels in the main and no copies in the sideboard. The Palace Sentinels are so good as a one-of. Like, in a perfect world, you don't really want 3 Palace Sentinels. You just want to always draw 1 a lot of the time, because you're not going to deploy the Palace Sentinels until you're sure you can protect yourself and keep your opponent from getting combat damage in to steal that Monarch token. But at the same time, you want enough Palace Sentinels in your deck to make sure you're drawing it consistently, but your second and third Palace Sentinels are just not that great, because if you've already got the Monarch token out, these additional repetitive Palace Sentinels that you're drawing are just 2/4s. They're just 4 mana 2/4s that don't do anything else. This is really not great. But when you're going up against something like Tron, being able to hit the Monarch on turn 4 is just so important in this kind of a matchup that having access to 4 Palace Sentinels is really important. So there's some tension there as far as basically when this red-white deck goes up against more dirtily decks that don't have a lot of attacking creatures, hitting your Monarch token on turn 4 is super important. When you're facing off against other aggressive creature decks that are just going to come at you and come at you and come at you, you don't really want to deploy a Palace Sentinels early. And something like having 2 copies of Palace Sentinels in your opening hand is just terrible. Just terrible when you're going up against another really aggressive deck. So that's the tension on the number of Palace Sentinels copies, and it has a lot to do with the metagame. It's really aggressive right now, so that's why, back in the, maybe a few months ago, it would have been more usual to see the full play set of Palace Sentinels between the main deck and the sideboard. Now I wouldn't be shocked to just see 3 in the main, or even 2 in the main, 1 floating around the sideboard or something like that. It's not crazy. Anyway, yeah, that's all for today. I know this was a really long deep dive on these Tron lists, but Tron is a beast, and even though I've spent a full 45 minutes just talking about some of the ins and outs of Tron, truthfully, there's still plenty that we could talk about. I mean, we didn't even talk about all the specific Tron matchups, and yeah, Tron is just one of the more nuanced, I don't know if complicated is the right word. I mean, once you figure out all the interactions, I don't know it's complicated, but there's so many interactions between what the cards in the Tron list can do and what it's doing with those interactions against other deck lists that it is somewhat complicated. And it's a lot to break down, but I think this has gone long enough, and I've given you a pretty good idea. Let me say one last thing about Tron, which is a lot of people out there may occasionally say that Tron should be banned, and I have mixed feelings on that. I could probably do a whole video just talking about whether or not Tron should be banned. I will say that as a deck that is currently holding between this and other iterations of Tron that pop up, we're talking about less than 10% of the meta, and that's tolerable. The biggest drawback to a deck like Tron being out there is that it's so good against other mid-range decks that I say other mid-range decks. I mean, Tron could be mid-range, it could be control, but it's so good against mid-range decks that it really squeezes a lot of mid-range decks out of the meta. Mid-range decks are pretty good against aggro decks, and you know, that helps to keep aggro in check. So in this weird, funky way, I think that Tron actually exacerbates a more aggressive metagame out there. Not just because aggressive decks can get underneath Tron sometimes, but because Tron polices other mid-range decks. So it just depends on how you feel about that. If you think that Pauper's a better format when there's more aggression and tempo and that kind of stuff going on, then it's probably good for Tron to exist to keep other mid-range decks in check. On the other hand, if you like seeing a wide variety of mid-range decks floating around out there, Tron definitely squeezes that variety down. Because anytime you're going to build a mid-range deck, you first have to ask yourself, would I just be better off going with a Tron plan that's going to give me a lot more mana? And yeah, I mean, especially let's say you want to build some kind of a mid-range deck, you don't have Tron, and let's say you're not playing something that has easy access to a lot of card advantage. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you want to play like some kind of a mid-range deck that just has really good synergies, a little bit of card advantage, a lot of really high quality creatures and good removal, but you don't have a ton of card draw. You're just not hitting on any kind of axis to have any chance at all against Tron. If you don't have counter spells or massive card advantage options, you're just going to lose every single time when you take mid-range up against Tron. I shouldn't say every time, but a lot of the time it's going to be brutalizing. So that's one of the things about Tron. So I don't really like that about Tron, but I do like the fact that in a weird, wonky kind of way, in my opinion, it helps to allow aggressive strategies to stay more vibrant. And this is important because in a format like Pauper, a lot of the removal and card draw, I mean, this is a format that has access to Lightning Bolt, that has access to Brainstorm. You've got access to tons of 1 and 2 mana removal options. You've got Preordain, Gush. There's just a lot of card draw and removal options, so it's not hard for mid-rangey control stuff to get ahead of the field. And Tron checks that a little bit. I mean, if you get so dirtily and card advantagey and land destruction oriented that you build this tailor-make yourself a mid-rangey control deck that can beat Tron, well, having access to a boatload of counter spells and land destruction and all of this card draw and dirtily stuff, you're just going to get blown out by aggressive decks. So that puts the real squeeze on a lot of these decks like blue-black control as far as what angles they're going to attack on. This is probably a good thing. So even though I think that Tron may actually hurt the overall diversity of Pauper to some extent, I do think it actually keeps the format healthier as things currently stand. Tron is inherently powerful enough in both Pauper and probably also in Modern that there could come a point in time when there's a certain combination of cards that Tron could utilize to just become too broken and too powerful and become oppressive to the whole format. As long as that doesn't happen, I think Tron's probably okay. I actually think Pauper is in an extremely healthy place right now. There have been several times in the past when Pauper was just messed up, largely because of things that involved free mana. Not just, a lot of mana like Tron, but free mana. And when there were locust lands, when you had access to creatures that you could use to untap your lands and get infinite mana combos by blinking creatures that untap your lands, that was a really broken time for Pauper. But with the way things are right now, at this exact moment in time, I think Tron's fine. I think Pauper's in a really healthy place. I guess I should also mention, while I'm just free associating about the state of Pauper and the current metagame and bannings and that kind of stuff, right now where Delver and Izzet Delver at right now, having that be the best deck in the format with less than 20% of the metagame. I mean, just looking at, if you actually treat Izzet Delver and Mono Blue Delver as different decks, which I don't know if you really should or not, but I think it's fair to. They do operate on a slightly different game plans, even though it's pretty close to the same. It's significant. And I think having these decks be at the top of the metagame is perfectly fine. Izzet Delver is a perfectly fine deck list to be at the top of the metagame. I think that's a much healthier state than really having some oppressive control deck or having Tron. I would much rather have Is It Delver at the top of the meta. I think that's a much healthier situation. Brainstorm is really good, but the reason why Brainstorm and Gush and things like this hopefully will never be banned from Pauper in any kind of overreactive way is because while those are absurdly good card drawing engines, this is not like Legacy or Vintage where the things that you're drawing into are just absurd and going to win the game on the spot. You're using Brainstorm and Gush to draw into 2/2 creatures or other card draw things or 1-for-1 removal spells, or maybe eventually assembling some kind of synergy to get a lot of cards or a lot more mana. But you don't have just really crazy busted stuff that you can use your Brainstorms and your Gushes on. You're just not going to see that kind of interaction. So that keeps the card drawing in check, where dirtling around is inherently kept in check by aggressive strategies. And again, having aggressive strategies be viable and vibrant in Pauper, I think is an important part of the equation. So all of that is just to say, I hope that nothing gets banned anytime soon. Pauper's in a great place, as long as Wizards doesn't make a huge mistake in a modern Masters or regular Masters set where they downshift something that really screws everything up. I think the way that the New World Order is operating right now, I think it's highly unlikely for any commons to emerge in the new sets that are going to break Pauper. Just the philosophy of what commons are in new sets prevents the vast, 99.99% of those type of commons from ever breaking Pauper. So as long as Wizards doesn't do something stupid in a Masters set with a downshift, right now and really going forward, I mean, as crazy as this sounds, I think it's very possible that with the at least Magic Online Pauper, we could see a format that doesn't need a banning for the next 5-6 years, which is a crazy thing to say, but I think it's highly possible. So I don't know, there are occasionally those things like Treasure Cruise that come around, but usually when Wizards makes mistakes with overpowered things in new sets, usually it's in the rare and the mythic slot, occasionally even uncommon. Anyway, that's all, guys. Hope you enjoyed it. And again, if you want me to do a deep dive on any other particular deck, then just leave a comment, request. If you want me to talk about anything else particular in the Pauper meta, let me know. My game plan going forward is basically to hit a deep dive on all of the major decks in the metagame, and then once that's done, maybe start touching on some of the more tier 2, tier 3 style decks, and or just talk more about the metagame in general, spend more time talking about the weekly challenge results, little tips and tricks on sideboarding and what might be good at any particular point in time. But for now, it's a goal of mine to make sure that the channel has a deep dive on all the major decks, so that when someone comes to the channel and they really want to, spend an hour making sure they know about every possible important interaction in a particular deck, they can do that. Anyway, that's all for today. Peace!